好的，各位老师，我们下面准备开始下一场讲座。呃，下一位主讲人是Luka Svilar。讲座的主题是踝关节与腘绳肌损伤的重返赛场方案。卢卡他是巴斯克大学的体育科学博士，擅长篮球运动员的力量与体能训练，然后还与排球、网球和足球项目合作过。他目前在拜仁慕尼黑篮球俱乐部担任运动表现主管。呃，之前在2019到20赛季任职的篮球队获得了西班牙的联赛冠军，然后在20到21赛季。任职的篮球队获得了欧洲杯的亚军以及VTB 联赛的冠军。然后他著有《精英篮球运动员的体能表现要点》，以及篮球的功能性运动准备练习，以及多篇关于篮球运动复合监测的文章。然后下面我们开始卢卡的讲座。
Hello to everyone. It is a pleasure to be with you and share a little bit of my knowledge today. For all of you who don't know anything about me, I just want to say briefly that I work as a strength and conditioning coach or a physical performance specialist in European basketball. Currently, I work for FC Bayern Munich basketball team that competes in EuroLeague and the German Championship. Today, I'm going to talk to you about return to play process, and we're going to talk a little bit more about criteria, how we test and retest after certain injuries, and a little bit about load monitoring and especially how important it is during the return to play process. So basically, the organization of this webinar or this presentation is pretty simple. We're going to talk a little bit about the RTP process, okay, what are the stages in a return to play. Then we're going to talk about two different injuries in order to give you practical examples on how we handle the return to play process in basketball. One is going to be connected to ankle sprain, and then we're going to give an example through hamstring strains, and then finally we're going to talk about load monitoring and especially about acute uh, versus chronic workload ratio that can help us a little bit to control the spikes in overload or underload, and in that way we are trying to avoid uh, players to get injured. As I said, a little bit to explain how the return to play process works. Of course, everything starts unfortunately with the injury, and then after that injury, we have to have some kind of evaluation of the injury. We have to know the grade and how serious the injury is. And normally, this is done by medical staff. It can be a medical doctor or a physiotherapist who are there on the site and can evaluate player right away, or they go to their room, medical department room, where they assess the problem on a stretch table. Then after the evaluation, the rehab process can start. Okay, and then of course this rehab process includes the work of medical and physical performance department. And at some point, when medical department and strength and conditioning coaches decided we need to reevaluate the quality of rehab, then we will run certain tests, and some of them we will mention later on in the practical examples on ankle sprains and hamstring strains. Finally, after the reevaluation and when we say that player can return to train, then he starts with different physical activities. Some of them are not so related to their sport. Some of the activities are. So, for example, strength training is not so similar to basketball, but then if we start working on skills, then we are talking about training that is very connected to our sport. And then finally, after returning to train and in if we improve physical performance and readiness of the player to play the game, actually to compete, then we are talking about uh, the real return to play process. And this is basically a loop that goes from the injury all the way to return to play process. When we are talking about the main responsibilities during the rehab process, and we can differentiate different phases or stages of rehab. But if we talk about initial, intermediate, and final phase, then we have, of course, different responsibilities between the medical department and strength and conditioning or physical performance department. So initial phase, as we said, medical department is there to control the whole process, and of course strength and conditioning department is there to help to support, but mainly in the initial phase of rehab, player is usually more time with the medical staff working to improve different things that he has to improve, and then strength and conditioning coaches are there just to support a little bit this phase. During the intermediate phase, it's a little bit different. Strength and conditioning coaches will take a little bit more over the process, and then medical staff is there to support. And in the final phase, of course, we always have to communicate with the medical department, but basically, in this final phase, they don't work with the player as much as they did before, because uh, we expect that in the final phase, players are injury pain free, so there is no problem to train well. And then, of course, strength and conditioning department is responsible for all training activities, and they should communicate with basketball coach, head coach, or the assistant coach to organize activities for this player if we are talking about return to train or then return to play moment. Now, I have to say that it is a general idea of how rehab process looks like, and responsibilities that are different between medical and strength conditioning department and sport coaches. But of course, these things might change or might be very different if we have different type of injuries. So, for example, if we have knee ligament partial tear, whatever the ligament is, just like if we have a knee injury, it's completely different rehab process when the finger on the arm is dislocated, because we know that when the knee ligament gets hurt in that initial phase, medical department will work a lot, and they will basically control the whole initial phase. While if the finger gets dislocated, maybe in the initial phase of rehab, medical and strength and conditioning department will work together, because if only one finger on hand is dislocated, that means that strength and conditioning coach can do a lot immediately during the initial phase. And that initial phase is basically very, very short, as we can immediately move to the intermediate phase and start working on everything but moving that one finger. While during the knee ligament partial tear, we have to wait for a couple of weeks at least until the ligament uh, heals, and in that sense, we normally avoid all of the lower body activities such as running, cycling, squatting, or doing any kind of movements with that injured leg. Now, if we talk about reality, what we have during a rehab process, and this is an example when we have an injury of lower extremities, general uh, is that that means that it's a general uh, type of injury, and in that phase we basically avoid running. So um, it means that most probably we will not even do some kind of cycling because we cannot have too much load on the injured extremity. But then we move once the player gets healed and they can start with low to moderate running or skills training. It means that we can start working on the court, uh, us as strength and conditioning coaches, and of course, sport coaches. Then we move to higher intensities, of course, when it comes to skills work and running. And after that, we are again in this return to train process where we talk about the sport. In my example, it's basketball, and then we finally go back to compete. So, um, in it means that in the first phase of lower extremity, so like when the injury happens, the general protocol is that we work on everything but lower extremities. So it can be a lot of core, upper body exercises, and so on. And then during the no run phase, we continue to work on core and upper body, whatever the need is. Is it hypertrophy? Is it upper body power? Is it core endurance? Is it core strength? Whatever we need to develop. And then we move from low to moderate to high intensity running and skills. And finally, we go back to our sport to train it and to play. Of course, between every stage, we have certain tests, we run certain tests, and we evaluate our player. And if criteria is met to progress to the next stage, we do it. Otherwise, we stay in our phase until criteria is met in order to progress to the next level. So to talk a little bit about ankle sprains. Ankle sprains are very common, unfortunately, in basketball. One of the most common lower body injuries, as there is a lot of contact, and unfortunately, landing on someone's foot is a common scenario. So basically, the injury mechanism is landing on someone's foot, as I said, and normally it can be different. There are many different ankle sprains, but normally majority of basketball ankle sprains cause damage to lateral part of the ankle. Now, some players prefer high shoes or high top shoes over low top shoes. Some of the players use ankle bandages, and some of the players use um, tape that provided by physiotherapists. And basically, in scientific research and what we have seen throughout the years in professional basketball, we have seen that there is basically no protection if you wear high top shoes or if you use ankle bandages. Uh, Normally, it is a personal preference of a player to use high top or low top shoes, or to tape or not to tape. And this is something that I always suggest players that they should do whatever feels better for them. I always tell the players honestly that I'm not a true believer in using ankle bandages, especially taping your uh, ankles, because what we know from practice and basically from some practical research is the fact that players who tape after 20 or 30 minutes of activities, uh, the tape gets loosened and basically does not protect so much the ankle from moving, but then in the long run, it has a negative impact on ankle mobilities. Uh, so ankle mobility. So in that sense, players should be careful of using tape excessively for every practices, every game, and so on. But this is just my suggestion. You know, if someone feels more safe when they tape, I will not go against it. So, in general, ankle sprains sometimes it is difficult to prevent. Uh, of course, it depends if it's a contact or no contact injury. If player uh, roll his ankle on the flat surface without any contact, those kind of injuries should not happen. But sometimes when we have a contact and someone pushes us and we land in an awkward position, and that leads to an injury is something that we cannot avoid very much. But we know from scientific research that if we are constantly working on uh, ankle muscles and muscles of the lower leg strength, and we work on a single leg balance, both in static and dynamic environment, and a lot of proprioception work, we can decrease the severity of the injury. So basically, uh, if we have good base, uh, maybe when the ankle sprain occurs, we can uh, decrease the grade of sprain. So from grade 3, maybe because of good work, we will in the end have a grade 2 ankle sprain. Now, the rehab process depends on the grade of sprain. So, is it grade 1, grade 2, grade 3? We have to know how severely the tissue is damaged. So, we have to know if the ligaments are okay, if they are partially ruptured or completely, what happened to muscle tendons, what happened to cartilage, what happened to the nerves, and so on. So, that's why the medical evaluation is critical in the early stage of ankle sprain. Now, the decision or the estimation of the time needed for full return to play process should be made by a medical doctor. Now, medical doctor together with physiotherapists, or we can call them medical staff, should run after the ankle sprain daily examinations to evaluate and manage the process of rehab, and of course to evaluate the progress if player is improving or uh, not improving from day to day. Now, if we have strength and conditioning coach or a rehab specialist who works on the rehab process, we should plan our work according to the recommendations of medical staff, and in that sense, follow their instructions. So, when it comes to real rehab, some general guidelines are as follows. The goal of the first phase after the ankle sprain is to maintain, or if we can improve ankle range of motion, we want to maintain the strength, so we can use a lot of isometric contractions of movements in the ankle and knee as well. And we can do basic stability or proprioception work, and normally it is done in static environment. Normally at that moment we avoid any kind of jumps, bounds, or hops. Now, when the swelling reduces and the pain goes down, strength training of the muscles can be more intense. We are talking here about harder isometric work and, of course, concentric and eccentric work. And balance exercises can move from static environment to more dynamic environment where we use those jumps, bounds, and hops. When the player reaches a very low pain in the ankle, such as 1 or 2 out of 10, uh, or doesn't report pain but says that there is just mild discomfort in the ankle, we can start running or performing some kind of low intensity plyometrics, such as skipping rope. Running or any activity that we do should be stopped if the pain starts to increase in the ankle. In the beginning, also, when it comes to conditioning, so when we want to improve aerobic and anaerobic capacities, I suggest you to do interval runs. Now, everyone says, okay, but how we should start interval runs because it's high intensity. Here, I'm not talking about high intensity interval runs. It's a low to moderate intensity running, but I think it's much more safe because when we tell the player to run for 1, 2, 3, or 4 minutes, and then he can stop or he can continue to walk for 1, 2, or 3, or 4 minutes to rest a little bit, we can know immediately if the pain is increasing. We can get a little bit better feedback because at that moment player is not so fatigued and focused on the activity, but he's now in the rest phase, and he can get a little bit better sensation on what is happening in his ankle. So due to safety reasons, I think it's better to do interval runs uh, early in the process of rehab. Of course, as the player gets used to straight to forward running, we can start doing some lateral movements and changes of directions because it is important part of basketball game or of any team sport such as soccer, American football, rugby, or even tennis. When we talk about key exercises, just to give you an example, what I like to do with my players, definitely first part, as we said, we have to continue to work on mobility, maintain it, or even improve it. So we can use different methods on how to perform it. We can use monster bands to do a little bit of joint distractions, or we can do some kind of compression with the rubber bands on the ankle, and in that sense move the foot, and once the rubber band is released we have greater range of motion. Then, of course, when it comes to strengthening, a little bit of isolated strength of lower leg muscles should come from manual resistance exercises such as the ones on the photo. Especially we are looking for the this kind of movement when the player pushes his foot outside because it will work on the peroneal muscles on the outside of lower leg, which are critical to keep the foot stable once you step on someone's foot. And as I said, static environment to do different single leg balance exercises, eyes open, eyes closed, throwing something from left hand to right hand, such as the kettlebell on this photo, or using a wooden board that is shaking under the body of a player. Then further on, we know that if player gets sprained ankle, there is a phenomenon called gluteal amnesia, which means that glutes tend to get deactivated, they tend to sleep, and they tend to get weaker. So as soon as we can, we should also start working not only on lower leg muscles, but on activating those glutes, and exercises such as isometric step up or squats with a rubber band around knees are a great way to wake up and strengthen those gluteal muscles. And then finally, we can progress a little bit more to dynamic environment where player on this, for example, exercises is standing in behind Bosu ball, and then at some point he's imitating a basketball layup by stepping on Bosu ball, which can imitate a little bit stepping on someone's foot, or we can make a little polygon and do bounds or jumps or single leg hops over hurdles on uneven surface such as the slant board, um, Air Max pillows, and Bosu balls. Criteria to uh, return to play after an ankle sprain rehab is based on two groups of criteria. One is subjective, one is objective. I think both of them are super important. First one is related to subjective criteria and pain discomfort that player has when running. So we don't want any type of pain or discomfort. When player is changing direction, we don't want any pain. And when we ask player if he's ready to participate in contact activities, he has to say yes. When it comes to objective criteria, we can do a lot of single leg static tests such as front reach or a star test or whatever the test you prefer. Then we can uh, assess on a force platform single leg hop, and we can look for height or force. So it has to be back to normal from the beginning of the season. Lateral bound test also has to be back to normal, as well as the change of direction test. It can be shuffling test or any kind of uh, 20 yards change of direction test or pro agility test, how they call it. So you choose the test. I think it's also important before player goes back to play, he has to do at least two individual skill sessions combined with some kind of contact drills, at least to do three training sessions with a big volume of a typical 75 minutes team practice, and at least two training sessions with a number of various high intensity movements similar to 75 minutes basketball practice. Now, of course, uh, volume we can assess by the time. So if player trains for 75 minutes, uh, we can say that he reached the volume that we wanted to achieve. But the best way to assess the volume is through microtechnology. If we have local positioning system or accelerometers, and we can track high intensity movements and overall movements, and we can know how many changes of direction, jumps, accelerations, decelerations player did. In that sense, we can be sure that we are on the right track to bring this player back to training and game. When it comes to load management, I think it's important to control the loads uh, when the player starts coming back to the team. So basically, this blue phase is the final rehab phase before player goes back to the team, and this is the first uh, game. So he wants to do a lot of work on basketball skills and contact, basketball skills and contact. So with individual coach. Okay, this day maybe we use a little bit to unload the player and to give him some time to recover and rest. And then when he goes back to the team, we decide to do this is full practice. Okay, this gray zone represents something that this player will not do. So he will do only 70% of this first practice with the team. Then he will do 85% of the whole team practice. And then one day before the game, I want player to do the whole practice with the team. And then his minutes in the game should be controlled, such as 15 to 20 minutes of game time. Now, another example would be hamstring tears, and there are different potential causes of hamstring strains. We can have weak muscles, we can have poor hip flexion and extension patterns, such as firing of psoas muscles and glutes. We can have poor co-contractions of muscles around knee, hip, and ankle and lower back. We can have insufficient mobility and control in those end ranges of motion. We can have lack of sleep or poor recovery, and we can have, as I mentioned in the very beginning of the presentation, acute underload or overload of the neuromuscular system. The rehab process after the hamstring strain normally depends on the grade of the strain uh, or how severely different structures are damaged. So we are talking here about muscle, about fascia, about nerves. The decision, as it is for the ankle sprain, is the same. The decision on time the player needs to come back to return to play should be made by a medical doctor, and then daily examinations should be made by medical staff so they can know if player improves, and also to give us instructions what to do and what not to do. So what is indicated and what is contraindicated in training and rehab process. So strength and conditioning coach or rehab coach should plan all the activities according to the recommendations of the medical staff. And then basically we have a couple of phases in hamstring strain process. We can say that first phase is 0 out of 3 because in that phase we are as strength coaches not doing anything basically for a lower body. It's a general training where we work on core, upper body, open chain exercises for not injured leg, and we can do some conditioning on, for example, arm ergometer. Then phase 1 is the phase where we start working on the injured leg, but definitely we do not have any running activities. So we can do a lot of isometric resistance exercises for the injured hamstrings and for other muscles in the lower leg. Of course, with some kind of low to moderate force. We are not pushing anything where a player could feel uncomfortable. And we want to do cycling, and we want to achieve at least 5 minutes of continuous cycling in moderate pace that player rates as pain-free. So some of the exercises can be isometric holds in this glute bridge position. So we are not doing any curls yet. We are not trying to move the knee. We are just trying to keep it isometrically activated and work on glutes and hamstrings together. Now, retesting should start right away also from our part, and we can do certain tests regarding ranges of motion, such as FMS, active straight leg raise, or we can do some uh, knee extension while hip is flexed movements to see uh, the range of motion in the knee. And we can use here the phone to track the angle and to see how angle of the shin improves from day to day. Then we can also palpate if this is the injured side. We can press around until we reach the scar tissue and the injured side to see how tender this part of the leg is. Then we can do some uh, tests with strength tests, isometric strength tests when it comes to dynamometry. And we can also check a firing pattern of glutes and hamstrings when the leg is being uh, elevated off of the stretch table. Definitely here, uh, we want to see on our uh, uh, outside finger that the player is activating glutes first and then hamstrings follow. In the second phase, we start running. Running is uh, in easy to moderate intensity, and based on the tests that I explained uh, previously, you can see that we want to achieve certain criteria. So we want to have at least 75% or more painless hamstring range of motion. We want to have more than 75% of uh, painless hamstring strength, isometric strength. We don't want to have any pain or tenderness when we are palpating the injured side. Okay, player has to say that he's ready to run, and there is no pain when player is running easily or in moderate intensity. At this moment, we can continue to work on isometric strength, but also we can start including some moderate intensity eccentric exercises such as uh, Nordic hamstrings, okay, regular uh, split squat or reverse lunges, or the sprinters hip extension flexion when we are trying to pull the whole body back. The hip will go into hip hinge motion, and then by extending the hip, the player should come back to the starting position. And in that way, work on the low back, hip, hamstring, calf, posterior chain. And phase 3 out of 3, the last phase, is high intensity running. Okay, in that moment, we want to uh, have more than 90% of initial range of motion and isometric hamstring strength. We definitely don't want any pain on palpation. And then when we run certain tests, such as lateral shuffle test, 20 meters acceleration, triple hop on a distance, those values need to be at least back to normal, and even between left and right uh, extremity, and player has to be pain-free in all of these tests. We can continue to work on more aggressive exercises such as single leg Nordic hamstrings. Then we can use flywheel technology to eccentrically overload certain muscles, and definitely great thing to do are the uh, co-contraction exercises by hitting the band, like hysterical child exercises. In this sense, we can work on various qualities when it comes to co-contraction, co-contractions, while we keep the legs outside or inside the rubber band. And for that work, I highly recommend work of an expert called Carl Dietz. for all the isometric work, another great guy is Alex Natera. So, to put it in a table, return to train and return to play criteria are as follows. We should not have any pain or discomfort. Uh, then you have to be, as a player, ready to participate in contact play, and you should not have any uh, muscle soreness or residual fatigue. When it comes to multi-directional change of direction tests, as we mentioned before, we have to have the values back in normal, and if possible, by using microtechnology to track all the movements in training, or at least to have some kind of like GPS system or a local positioning system, we should track volume and the intensity of uh, the activity, and then we should be very close to volume and the number of high intensity movements uh, compared to 75 minutes team practice. If we talk about final rehab phase, okay, and then we return to team and we return to play games, or something similar like after the ankle sprain, we work a lot on basketball skills and contact, basketball skills and contact, only basketball skills, then basketball skills and contact, and then we will have a day off to give player time to rest, not to come here in this phase with the team with residual fatigue. We want him to do 65 to 75% of the first practice, maybe 75 to 90% time of uh, uh, team practice second day, then full team practice before the first game, where the player will participate only 10 to 15 minutes. Then we'll have another 2 training sessions with the team, fully participates, and then we can improve a little bit playing time in the games. Another example how we controlled, for example, one player, and this is a blue player, is the guy who was injured and he's coming back to the team. This is an example from Catapult Technology Cloud. So we can see that this is the whole practice, starting from preparation to some drills, and then playing 5-on-5 on a full court and 5-on-5 on a half court. This is the blue guy who we want to do 60% of the training session. So you can see that training session on average is 459, and you can see that this player did only 265. And his basically substitution, a player, younger player on the team who helped him to control the loads, and his substitution was the orange guy. So basically, these two guys together accumulated 100% of training volume. When it comes to also participating 60% of the time in one specific drill, which in this case is, for example, this drill, you can see that drill was on average 136 units of player load. This player did 84 because he was substituted a lot with the orange young player. You can see another different example in this drill, similar ratio, and in that sense, we protect the player. And finally, something that I wanted to mention is the acute chronic workload ratio, something that was brought to us by an expert, Tim Gabbett from Australia, if I'm not mistaken. And he says that we always want to keep players from week to week in so-called sweet spot zone, where a player has a chance to perform physically at a high level and at the same time have lower injury risk. And the acute volume and intensity of the work should be in relation to a chronic load in sense that it is in a ratio of 0.8 to 1.3 between these two values. If we go overload or underload, we are in a greater injury risk. So injury risk happens if we overload players above this ratio of 1.5, or we even underload players in this ratio between 0.8. If you're interested a little bit more into research, you can check team's work in British Journal of Sports Medicine and some other articles as well. Now, I have to say that recent experts such as Franco Impellizieri and his colleagues said things against the acute chronic ratio, but I can tell you that from my practical experience, I found it very useful. I found connection between players being in a greater risk of injury when the spikes in overload and underload occur, and that's why I'm using it in my practical approach. I'm not always blindly trusting to the numbers, but when these numbers change and we get player with acute chronic ratio of 0.6 or 1.6, then I'm going to be more careful. I'm going to communicate more with the player and see how he feels. Another reason why I like to use it is the fact that another great study was made on basketball players, while Tim Gabbett's work is based more on Australian football, cricket players, and so on and so forth. There was a brilliant study made by Kathleen Weiss about use of acute chronic workload ratio among basketball players, and she said that the sweet spot zone is between 0.8 to 1.4 or 1.5 on that scale. And if you want to look a little bit deeper into new research, one great article was published last year, so you can check it out as well. So how we basically collect data and numbers to get the acute load and chronic load? Well, we can use many different methods. We can measure time of practices and all the activities during the week. We can measure player load from Catapult technology, but a simple tool that you can use from tomorrow is basically time of training session multiplied with a scale 1 to 10, how hard the practice was, or the RPE, rating of perceived exertion. So you ask the player after practice, 15 minutes after practice, when they cool down a little bit, how hard the practice was from 1 to 10, and they give you the number. You take this number, for example, for the player AB, he says 7, you multiply it with 90 minutes of training session, and you get 630 arbitrary units. Now, this is how a data collection for a week looks like in a chart for one player. So on Monday, player did a recovery session that was 3 out of 10 for 30 minutes. Then he did 30 minutes of strength, and he rated that as 6 out of 10, and so on and so forth. All the team practices, games, and so on. And this week, this player had 3,915 units of work. Now, to give you an idea how to calculate acute chronic ratio, we have acute workload. For example, for one player, it can be 4,062 arbitrary units that we just calculated in a table that I showed on a previous slide. Then to measure chronic workload, we have to take 3 weeks of load and their individual values. So week minus 3 was 3,612 arbitrary units. This was the value for week 2, and this was value for week 1. Now, chronic workload, is calculated by the average of these 3 weeks. In some cases, it can be 4 weeks or even 5 weeks. For me, I always go with average of 3 weeks to measure chronic workload, and this is the average value of these 3 weeks. Now, acute chronic ratio is pretty simple to get. You just divide acute with chronic workload and you get a value such as 1.14 in this case. And then you calculate for every player on your team. It's pretty simple to use it in, for example, Excel sheet. And then what I do in the long run, I have values for, here are the names of my players that I erased, okay? And then I go from week to week and I look what is happening with the values of my players, if we are keeping them in the green zone or for some reason we go outside of this zone, and the reason why it happens, I always know. But whenever I see an orange color appearing, I try to start communicating a little bit better with the player, with coaching staff, so we can put the player in the green zone as soon as possible, such as in this, for example, cases. After the orange case, we go into green zone as soon as possible. This was it for today. I hope you had some fun. I hope I helped you a little bit to at least keep your brain activated for the next couple of days, and you can check what you're doing and how you're doing with your athletes. And if you want to reach out, feel free to contact me on Instagram or through my email. And of course, I like to share as much as I can of my education and some interviews that I do with fellow coaches and some exercises on my YouTube channel. So feel free to check it out. Thank you guys. Bye bye.
好，这个有一些问题啊，这个我看到了，这个后台大家已经留言了，是这样啊，这个有些问题可能超出了我这边的这个知识范围啊，那么我就这个会通过邮件啊，包括里面有几个问题是提到的是关于我们讲师内容啊，比如说这个表格当中的一些指标，然后另外一些关于具体细节上的这个呢，我们部门的这个科研人员会跟我们的这个讲师进行这个 email 的联系，然后再进一步的确认，到时候反馈给大家。那么还有这个关于讲到的一些具体的恢复时间啊，那么从我这边的了解下来，就是这个我们其实脚踝的这个或者是膝关节受伤啊，这个还是从韧带、从这个结构啊、从肌纤维啊，那从这几个角度来看，首先要评估一下你这个受伤的程度啊，损伤的程度，然后对损伤的程度确定好之后，然后再来看你后面的这个康复的这样一个进程。那么我们通常受伤之后呢，可能会有一个24小时的这样一个急性期。那么在急性期之内呢，我们通常还是以这个制动啊，这个冰敷，然后这个尽可能的减少这个肿胀啊来处理。那么后续的如果是不严重，那我们经过我们的这个物理治疗师或者是我们的这个康复师评估好之后，再来决定你下一步的这个康复的进程啊。然后至于术后的这个前叉啊，这个断裂的这类的康复的这样一个这个程序啊，我觉得可能相对来说可能还是要根据不同的情况，包括你在术前的关节活动度肿胀的情况啊，因为很多时候现在讲这个前叉在手术之前最好能够进行这样一个肿胀的消除啊，恢复一定的这个活动度之后再进行手术之后呢，它的康复期会更快啊。那么所以这个呢也跟人的体质啊，每个人的个体的体质有关系，跟他术前的这个身体准备有关系啊，包括跟他的这个受伤的情况啊也有关系。所以这个术后的这个康复呢，我建议大家还是要能够去不要按照唯一一个统一的标准来进行啊，还是尽可能的去找到专业的咱们的这个机构、医院啊、康复的这个中心啊，或者是找到专业的这个专门的这个康复师啊，跟他来共同治疗啊，共同商议这个康复的这样一个计划。 那么至于说这个错过了恢复的时间能不能够补救啊，那这个也是要具体情况来具体分析的啊。那有些情况可能，如果是他的这个组织已经这个疤痕已经留下来了，然后这个错过了这个活动度的这个最佳时期，那可能他的康复时间可能就会更长啊。这个能不能够保证回到原来的功能？甚至是能够回到赛场啊，这个还不能够去通过这个简单的这个就能够去得出这样一个结论啊，这个希望大家能够去清楚这个事情。然后这里面还涉及到有一个问题，我看到是讲录像分析技术是否能够对这个有氧和无氧的占比进行这样一个分析。如果单纯的只靠分析技术啊，那我觉得这种分析呢，可能相对来说这个准确度可能会比较低。因为录像分析可能而且我们需要的就是要做的是很多的这种这个从这个分析当中获得的这个信息来进行这样一个换算和我们直接测量的这个还是有很大出入。另外呢，我们如果只从录像分析，那我们获得的信息通常就是距离跑动的速度，那我们还要知道这个队员他的最大速度是什么是多少，然后呢，我们根据他的这一整场的每个速度区间的跑动的距离来折算出它包括它的时间来看到它属于哪个区间的速度，然后再从这个速度来折算成它的这个强度通过强度呢再去计算它的这个功能比是第一系统的、第二系统的还是第三功能系统的，那么然后再来去看这个它的具体的这个有氧和无氧的占比。所以相对来说呢，如果只单纯的从录像技术分析这个角度呢，我觉得这个还是很难的。所以现在呢也有一些可穿戴设备，当然这个有些可穿戴设备还是相对来说对青训来讲可能是比较昂贵的那我们可以用一些比如说心率的监控心率带，那这个呢相对来说比较常用我们可以去做一些这方面的这样一个追踪